There we go. Okay, good.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Stevenson with New Direction Family Law, and thanks for joining us today on our Facebook Live. I want to introduce Melanie Nix with Perkins Psychological Services in Wake Forest. Thank you for being with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
We want to share some information with you about custody, divorce, and separation and the effects it has on children. And so we have an expert here to help us answer some questions with that. So Melanie, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your education and the type of population you work with?
Sure. So I'm a licensed counselor. I have a master's degree in counselor education. I've been working with children since about 2003, and I've been working with adults and families for about the past 10 years. And so I see clients for a wide range of issues, whether it's divorce and custody issues with families, to anxiety, depression, trauma, chronic pain, and things like that.
Okay, so very diverse, right?
Yes.
When clients come to see me, one of the first things I ask if they have children is, are your children in counseling or therapy, and are you? So some of the issues that come up for us are, what's the best way to, if they're resistant to go to counseling, what can I say to them that may help them see the benefits for their children to come to counseling?
Sure. Well, divorce is a huge loss for both the married couple and for the children. So I see a lot of reactions that are similar to grief,
right?
With children of divorce, and anger is very typical as well. And so I would say that it's really necessary to try to redefine family roles following a divorce or during a divorce. And many relationships also need work and repair.
Right.
I know for our office, we're definitely focused on what's going to be best for the child.
Right.
And so whatever they need. And so if there are fears associated with coming, that might be some reassurance.
Okay, that you put just like we do, we put the best interest of the child first, and so that's our first and foremost if there are children involved. Why is it beneficial? Can you give us some positives that come out of children coming to therapy or counseling when they're going through that with their parents?
Sure. Well, counseling is a safe place for our children to be able to talk about how they're feeling without needing to take sides.
Right.
So oftentimes children, even if parents do not put pressure on their kids to take sides, oftentimes children feel like they have to take side of one parent or the other.
Okay.
Especially if they're having visits with that particular parent or the other parent, whichever parent they're with, they may feel like they need to kind of be torn in between the two.
Right.
So this gives a safe place for them to talk about how they're feeling without having to take sides.
Okay. And so do children feel a sense of responsibility in their children, in their parent separation sometimes?
Yes, sometimes children will even take on parenting roles, and they feel like they may need to keep the peace because there's a lot of conflict.
Right.
So that change, I think, requires everyone to make adjustments, and sometimes that could be an unhealthy responsibility that a child feels that they need to take over a parenting role.
Right. You know, sometimes what I see is what we call alienation of one parent, where well, I guess you could explain it better than I, but it's where one parent tries to alienate the child from the other parent or won't let them see them and isn't supportive of that visitation. Are there any suggestions you can give to parents that can help them back out of their own grief and issues and anger and sort of step away from that?
Sure. Well, I think a good question to ask is this helpful
Good
to
question.
the child? Because sometimes we can let our own hurt
Right.
get in the way of what is best for the child. So definitely having someone to give feedback, as far as for myself as the counselor, on things that might make it easier
Mm-hmm.
with all the different transitions, and how visitations might work,
Right.
to reduce the conflict if at all possible.
Right.
And I think in times where there's alienation, that increases the conflict,
Absolutely.
which is not helpful.
No, it's not for the parents or for the child.
Right.
And that's another instance where they may step in and try to keep the peace and sort of make everybody. Do they feel like they have to make everybody happy? Children sometimes in that situation.
Well, sometimes. I think more often than not, though, I see when with the non-custodial parent, the parent that's not present, or they're not, or maybe visitation has stopped, or we're working on how the visits might look. I find that there's more of a tendency to be angry with the parent who's not present.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it's easier to blame the person who left
Right.
the home,
Right.
even if it was healthier to leave the home for the whole family. That maybe it's easier to point the finger of blame
Right.
at that parent, and maybe they're also getting some feedback at home.
Right.
That it was the other person's fault. So oftentimes I would say there's a lot of anger directed at the person who's not around as much.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way. What's your policy on, a lot of times, there are two types of custody, legal and physical custody. And so sometimes parents have joint legal custody, which means both of them can be a part of making those big decisions, like, do they go to counseling?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens if one parent wants them to, but one parent doesn't want them to,
Yes.
but the child needs to be in counseling or therapy?
Sure. Well, I do think that is difficult, and it's very common. We have a contract that we have divorced parents sign, and if at all possible, both parents would sign that contract.
Right.
And basically what that does is it agrees that the counseling is for the child,
Okay.
and that I'm here to support the child and what they need while going through the divorce, and for both parents to agree to not have counseling be a part of the legal proceedings.
Okay.
That's part of our agreement. And I think sometimes that takes some of the fear away that a parent might have of things that are discussed in counseling maybe being used against them.
in court, yeah.
So if a child is talking about they're angry with that parent, that there might be a fear that this is going to be used against me later on.
Right.
But when in fact that's actually a typical part of the process of coming to counseling, is to be able to get all of those negative emotions off your chest.
Well, it's sort of like what you talked about in grief, and those, what are there, 7 stages or 5 stages of grief, and then, and as I understand it, you have to work through those or you sort of get stuck on one. So going through that anger phase can help them actually move in a more positive direction at some point.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What do you, well, speaking of court, I don't like subpoenaing counselors and therapists to come to court because I don't want to upset that special relationship and confidential relationship you have with that child. But sometimes it's just unavoidable. So, have you been subpoenaed? Have you been to court? What's your thoughts on that?
I have been subpoenaed. I have been to court. I have been required to turn over counseling records. Every situation is different, but I would say more often than not, that tends to terminate the counseling relationship, court involvement, meaning the relationship is damaged with my client. I know I often work with guardian ad litem services, and when a guardian ad litem is involved, I find that to be a positive experience for my clients rather than negative and damaging to the relationship. I think that this is just my interpretation of how that works, is that because the guardian ad litem makes their own observations and they also take my recommendations and my feedback into account, it's seen as more of the guardian ad litem
right.
and the information they're presenting versus it's directly coming from me.
So it doesn't, which can help not damage that relationship and terminate that therapy.
Yes.
For those of you who don't know, guardian ad litems they're either court appointed or the parents can agree to have someone appointed, and generally it can be someone who's trained as a guardian ad litem or an attorney who is the attorney for the child and speaks on their behalf, so they can have a voice. And so they can step in and say to the court, here's what I recommend. I've talked to the child, I've talked to the counselors, I've talked to all the other collaterals, and here's what we believe is in the best interest of the child. So the court can get a more rounded idea of what's actually going on. So that's a positive for you when that's involved?
I see that as a positive. I think it tends to be more common in high conflict cases, for sure. But that allows me to, I feel, safely give some feedback on my concerns without having to turn over the counseling records.
Right. Yeah. And I know that, especially in Wake County, that we have family court judges, so you're assigned a family court judge for the life of your case, and they don't want to see the notes. It's like what they want to hear from you is, if you can, make recommendations, because you really are an impartial third party. As I say, you don't have a dog in the fight. What you want to do is do what's in the best interest of this child and this family. So you really can be an advocate, even though you hate going to court. It can be a benefit for the child, I think, in those things. Do you see the child, do you tell mom and dad what the child says to you in therapy? Or is that...
That's a good question. So confidentiality becomes a bit tricky when working with families, especially in divorce cases. There's always safety.
Right.
I have to report safety concerns to parents because that is the exception to confidentiality. However, I try to use my best judgment and keep as much private, meaning just between the child and myself, as possible. And I usually ask kids for their feedback on things they want me to share and what they do not want me to share as well.
That's great. That's very empowering for them to have a say in that. That's wonderful. So do you meet with... Tell me typically what happens if a family comes in and they want their child or children to see someone like you. What happens on a typical visit? Do you talk to mom and dad? Do you just talk to the child?
Yes. So sometimes, typically I will check in with parents and just kind of get some feedback from them on what their concerns are, and then I might meet with the child individually and give them some time on their own. Sometimes kids do ask for their parents to be involved. I usually do let that be up to the child.
Okay.
And that's not always the case with all counseling, but I think especially for divorce cases, if there might be a need to work on or repair relationships.
Right.
And I see the healing process as happening in stages. So the first stage is to be able to get all of the emotions, all the hurt and anger out, and that might be done in different ways, whether it's talking to a parent about how they feel, writing a letter, and then the second stage would be finding a way to get some closure from all of the hurt with all of the things that have happened with separation and divorce, and find a way to let go of anger and forgive.
Right.
And then the third stage would be repairing and reconciling relationships. And so many times parents will be involved as part of that process. Sometimes kids say, I don't want my parents involved. And that's okay too, because I think healing and closure can happen without the parents needing to be involved.
Right.
The kids can do that in counseling.
And I'm assuming that that there's no, you can't say, oh, in 3 sessions we can do this. It's sort of an individual sort of process that it could take a short time, a long time.
Sure. Right. Well, sometimes it depends on how long the custody case or divorce case legally is taking. I find that if the legal proceedings are prolonged, that also prolongs counseling.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because sometimes kids feel that they need the closure of the finality of the legal decisions so that they know what to expect.
Right.
So without that, oftentimes they feel like they're in limbo. But there is no way to put a time frame on how long.
Right.
And I think additional support as visitations happen might be needed just occasionally.
Sort of facilitate that if issues pop up. Do you find that children of separation and divorce, what do parents need to look for? I mean, does every child need to be in counseling, or are there certain things that you think the parents, if you see this or you hear this, you might want to check in with somebody?
Sure. Well, it's difficult because of the fact that some children do try to take on parent roles. They may seem like they've got it all together,
right.
The child, and that they're doing really well and coping really well. I think counseling would benefit any child whose parents are going through divorce. But definitely if there's conflict between the parents, conflict between the child and one or both of the parents, then it would be helpful for repairing relationships.
Do you see, parents say this to me all the time, or clients do, that, well, we're in separate rooms, and although we may fight and argue, we do it upstairs, or we make sure the kids aren't there. And so I've always been of the mindset that you may think you're doing that, but kids are pretty smart, and they pretty much know what's going on. Sure. Would you agree with that in some respects?
Sure. Well, our thoughts have energy, and they can create, if there's negative energy in the home, that creates a lot of tension for kids. I actually think kids are more perceptive of that than adults, that they pick up and they respond accordingly. It's in some ways a survival mechanism that they read their environment and try to figure out the best way to respond. So they definitely would pick up if there's tension, separation, marital discord in the home.
Good. And I really want parents to hear that, because I think it's really important. And I've had someone that I work with who is in a domestic violence situation. It wasn't physical, but it was emotional and verbal. And there's an older child in the home, and so it's been going on so long that at this point the child would just come out if he heard something, make sure mom was okay, and then go back. And so it's really hard for folks to get themselves out of that type of situation. Do you work with children who are in that sort of domestic violence home, even if there's not physical abuse, that educating them on verbal abuse, emotional abuse can be just as damaging?
Sure. Worked with many children who experienced trauma and domestic violence in the home. And I think that was a good example of a child trying to take on a parent role and try to take responsibility for protecting their mother. And oftentimes kids will start to mimic those abusive behaviors as well. So if at all possible, and there's plenty of research to support this as well, that children fare better in a single parent home that's healthier
There, right.
versus a 2-parent home that's an unhealthy dynamic.
Do you, we talked about guardian ad litems, and we also have in Wake County and in North Carolina, they're called parenting coordinators, which is also for high conflict cases. Generally, it's a family law attorney who, instead of going to court over who didn't put the socks back in the, the visitation bag when we exchange, or even things like where the child's going to go to school or if somebody's moving, they can sort of step in and make those decisions. So have you ever worked with parent coordinators and you find them to be helpful in this situation?
I have not worked with a parent coordinator, and I'm not familiar with that term. I do know that one of the guardian ad litems that I worked with recently apparently there's an app for parents to communicate appointments. I just learned about that.
Yes.
So in high conflict, the appointment gets put on the calendar, and important information that needs to be exchanged goes through.
Yeah, we use in Wake County. They usually order like our family wizard, so that
that's it.
Because a lot of times parents, especially if they're just separated or just gotten divorced, they really do have a hard time communicating.
Sure.
But they have joint custody, legal custody, and physical custody, and so it's really hard if you can't co-parent to be joint. Have joint time. So those sorts of things can really help sort of diffuse those situations. What else can you share with the folks that are watching that that can be beneficial to them that they can do, perhaps to support their children as they go through separation and divorce?
Well, I would say allowing your child to express how they're feeling without fear of repercussion or without taking it personally, just validating the child's feelings of hurt and anger, and as long as that needs to happen, allowing them to do that. Because
when you say validating, can you just give an example of that? If your child's were sharing that anger or that hurt or upset, what can be a response that you can do not to close off that emotion?
Yes. So I think just human nature, and especially as a parent myself, we tend to want to fix it, and so we go into fix-it mode, and try to offer solutions, and there may not be a solution to the hurt other than allowing the child to express that. So I think the validation would mean saying, I'm sorry you're going through this, and I'm here for you, and I know this is hard, and it must be really difficult for you especially, and trying to make it more about the child than it is about the parent, which is definitely hard to do in times of high emotion.
That's the thing, is that you combine all that, and then you have a child who you really do love and want to do the best for and fix, because you feel like you've screwed up so bad sometimes that you just want to make that situation better. So that's great advice. Do you have any questions for me on the family law side that maybe you come across and when you're working with kids or parents?
Sure. I think sometimes it's confusing to understand the different types of mediation, and so if you could explain how mediation works and what types of mediation might be involved.
When I heard you say, I think it's a very powerful message that you said, the longer the litigation goes on, the longer that child may be in conflict or turmoil because they need an end to it. So one of the best ways, what we try to do is settle first, and we call it alternative dispute resolution, ADR. So it is mediation, where parents can sit in separate rooms with their attorney, and then an impartial third party, a mediator, usually a family law attorney, goes back and forth between the rooms so that the parents are free to express and say what they need to say. And what we say about mediation is that it's effective and successful if each party walks away equally unhappy. Because in mediation, in any kind of dispute resolution, you've got to be able to give up something to really get where you want to be and find a middle and keep them focused on the children. And then there is arbitration, where you don't go to court, but an attorney acts as a judge. And so you would sit in a conference room, and you could be called as a witness and testify and that sort of thing, but it doesn't have you're not in the courtroom, so it's a little less formal. But it can, the arbitrator acts as a judge and can make a decision about how that's going to go. Parents can work it out together, and you can work through your attorneys without having anyone else involved, and sign a court order or consent order, or sign a separation agreement that can have custody provisions in there. And so the best thing for families is not to litigate, because you walk into a courtroom with a judge who doesn't know you, who may hear your case for an hour or two or a couple of days, and they're going to make a decision about really the rest of your life and your children's lives. So I really depend on folks like you to help parents understand how important it is to get the conflict resolved so that everybody can move on. So, your services, this profession, is invaluable to what I do with parents. So I just want to say thank you, one, for doing that, and two, for being with us today. It was really helpful. I have 1,000 other questions, but I know we have to wrap it up. But thank you so much. How can people get in touch with you and with Perkins Counseling and find out more about you?
I think the quickest way is just to look at our website, Perkins Counseling and Psychological Associates. If you Google that, we get reports every week of how many Google hits we get. So,
and do you do children and adults? I mean, you sort of have the whole family system that you can help and support here, right?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
right. So do check out Perkins Psychological Services in Wake Forest, and if you want to find out more or see the repost, you can go to our Facebook page or our web page at newdirectionfamilylaw.com. And if you want to find out more about your legal rights and options and how we can help, please give us a call or visit our website, and we're happy to talk to you. Thanks.